Welcome to Therapist Confidential, a psychotherapy.net podcast. And now, here's your host, Travis Heath.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Therapist Confidential podcast. I'm your host, Travis Heath, and today I'm joined by Gordon Brewer. He's a licensed therapist. He's a private practice consultant. He has his own podcast, the Practice of Therapy podcast. And so he'll be an interesting guy to talk to for any number of reasons. But in this conversation, I'm most interested in talking about kind of the business of therapy, which I don't even really like saying that, if I'm being honest, but it's critical. I mean, we can have whatever opinions we have about the economic systems we exist in, and figuring out a way to have a sustainable career financially and otherwise is essential. And so we'll talk about this today and talk about this. I don't know, it's like the gold standard private practice, this term. I think most students I speak with, as an educator, they want to be in private practice. Like, what does this actually mean? How do we actually accomplish such a thing? And so Gordon's really an expert on this, and he will lend us some of his wisdom on this today. Gordon, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Travis. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can tell the folks a little bit about who you are.
Okay. Well, yes. So I'm Gordon Brewer. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and have a small private practice in Northeast Tennessee, Kingsport Counseling Associates. I have 5 clinicians that work for me and 1 admin person. And most people tend to know me, though, from my podcast, the Practice of Therapy podcast, which I started in 2017, which when I say that, it just seems incredible that I've been doing it that long, but most people know me from that. And in addition to my clinical work here in my practice, I'm also do consulting through the practice of therapy, just helping folks that are navigating all the ins and outs of being in private practice, whether they're wanting to grow or expand their current practice or whether they're just getting started and trying to figure out how to do all the stuff. But I've been in private practice since around 2006, and so started out like a lot of people do, working for an agency. I work for a nonprofit organization, and we mainly worked with at-risk children and youth. And so I made the transition over to private practice and have been here ever since. And so, yeah, and so it's been a fun journey. And I will say that when I first went into private practice, there were very few resources out there about how to start a private practice, just the whole business side of running a practice. And so that was my reason for starting the practice of therapy was just sharing what I've learned and being able to share resources, and I get to talk to really great people along the way.
Mm. Yeah, I did a short solo episode on private practice, a few months back. And it was fascinating because it got more interest than I think any other podcast that we've done. And I think we've had really cool people on. We've discussed some really interesting topics. And yet that one just drew so much interest. And I talked some about my own journey in that episode. But I think this is the same for a lot of people going into private practice, where I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I didn't even really know how to get started. I mean, I had a very lovely mentor, Dr. Marianne Watson, who basically let me use her office for free. I mean, I think she made me
Mhm.
pay her like, $25 a month or something. I mean, it's a negligible amount. And,
Right.
I started off seeing literally 2 or 3 people. Now, I had an academic job, which was useful in terms of having a salary and health insurance and these kinds of things we need in the modern world. But I started
Mhm.
off very slow. I had no idea what the heck I was doing, and it built up over a period of years. And I remember I eventually started making a decent amount of money, and my mom, who knows stuff about taxes and things, she's like, "Well, you're probably going to have to pay quarterly taxes now." I go, "What the heck is this? I don't even
Yeah.
quarterly tax. I'll pay
Mhm.
all my taxes at the end of the year." She's like, "No, you're going to have to do that." So that's just one small example. There were all these little things that popped up. that I really had no idea about. I was essentially teaching myself on the fly. I jumped off the cliff and then tried to tried to create wings as I was going. There's something to be said for learning that way. Also, gosh, I wish in graduate school or somewhere someone would have helped me understand some of the ins and outs of this. And so that gives you a little bit about my own journey, but I'm wondering,
Mhm.
is this how you typically, when you're consulting with folks, is this typically how you see people coming into private practice where they want to do it? They've heard this term private practice, but they really
Mhm.
don't have any formalized training about what the heck to actually do.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's yeah, exactly the kind of the phenomenon that you described there is just really what I've seen so much because our schools and graduate programs and all of that do a really good job of teaching us clinical skills and how to work with clients. But I know when I came through, I think it's changing a little bit now, but when I came through, there was zero course information or courses around how to start a private practice, which really, the way you think about it is you're starting a business, is really how you have to think about it. I think a lot of times people, particularly in our world as clinicians, I think the stigma is changing, but I think a lot of times we don't see that clinical work and business necessarily match because we have this idea that if we make it a business, then it's kind of taking the human doesn't seem as compassionate for some reason, but
Hmm.
that's really not true at all. And one of the things is that I think, at least and this is a little bit opinion, but what I do see in just talking with people is that when you're able to get the freedom of being in private practice, really you can hone in on your clinical skills and what you want to specialize in. And that's a key factor in having a successful private practice is to really do that. And I think the other thing that really kind of gets people interested in private practice is if you've ever worked for an agency, whether it's a nonprofit or some sort of public agency, you don't have too much control over your caseloads and also just the types of clients that you see. You really kind of get it all, and it gets very overwhelming very quickly. So I think having the autonomy that private practice brings is very appealing to people.
Absolutely. So someone comes to you, Gordon, and says, okay, maybe I've been working in community mental health or I'm wrapping up my postmasters or postdoc hours, whatever it is. And now
Mhm.
I want to go into private practice. What are some of the first bits of advice you might give them in making that transition?
Yes. So for one thing is don't quit your day job too quickly. Now and what I mean by that is you need to really kind of think about what are your financial goals. I mean, one of the things that happens so many times that I've worked with people around is that they think, well, I'll just go into private practice, and they think, well, I'll hang out my shingle and the clients will just automatically come to me and I'll have be able to just replicate what I had when I was working for someone as far as their salary and all that sort of thing. But it's a little more complicated in that, in that you're moving from being an employee to being self employed. And there's a big difference there between those two things. You got to think, like you alluded to already, Travis, is the tax consequences of that and how you have to manage all of that. And then marketing and also who are your referral sources going to be and how many clients do you need to see in order to match your salary from what you were making at an agency? And so you have to really think about that and really kind of think it's a good idea to really think about, okay, what is the why behind going into private practice besides the autonomy and just kind of I think a lot of time people see private practice as being more glamorous than working for an agency, but that's not necessarily true because uh, there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that happens in a private practice that we don't really think about, particularly people that have been working for an agency. So I think really having a lot of clarity around why you want to go into private practice and what you expect to gain, and then really coming up with a plan of how you get there. And one of the big things that I tell people that are thinking about it is, as I mentioned earlier, don't quit your day job too quickly. And a good way to transition into it is to start doing it kind of part time or on the side, so to speak, and build from there. And that way you're not under the financial pressure of having to make sure that you've got enough money on hand to support yourself while your practice builds. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that might have the financial means as far as they've got money in reserve to kind of hold them over and help them support themselves while they're building their practice. And that's one of the things too that I recommend from the very beginning is start building your reserves so that when you hit those lulls and the number of clients you're seeing or you get into a slow season where you don't have as many referrals that you've got a way to support yourself through all of that.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions that people come up against when they're thinking of transitioning or starting a private practice, and you alluded to it a little bit, is how do I get clients? And there are different ways, of course. It's
Mhm,
interesting because like you mentioned, people come in with different amounts of financial resources. I mean, some people,
mhm,
whether it be through family or whether it be through marriage, whatever it is, they may have more money, or maybe they've made a career change and they had money that's, they've saved from their prior career. And then some people come
mhm,
in with basically no money when they're looking to do this. So one of the things that
mhm,
I've noticed is that, and this is true in most places in life, but people start from really different places. And so I imagine
mhm,
part of it is seeing where people start from. But I think for a lot of folks that I've come in contact with interested in private practice, and I've been doing private practice for 20 or so years at this point,
mhm,
and people will ask, well, how did you get it going? And I'm like, I don't know if the way I got it going is necessarily the way you should go about it. But I think the bigger question is, for them to say, how can I get it going? And there are different options, right? Like some people might
mhm.
get on insurance panels or third party
Right.
payer panels right away. And there are pros and cons to that, right? Maybe they already have other referral sources from the community, but I'm wondering if you can address what you've learned about this crucial aspect, which is how do I actually get clients and referrals?
Right, right. Well, one of the things that you alluded to was getting on insurance panels, and one of the big debates within the private practice world, not maybe debates a little bit strong word, but one of the big things is a lot of people try to decide whether or not they want to be on insurance panels or be strictly private pay, and the payoff for one or the other is with private pay, you get to dictate what you get per session. You get to decide, okay, this is my fee, this is what I'm going to charge for my work, and then people pay you directly. And so that's a very kind of simple way of doing things, but the downside is that you have to work harder at marketing your practice to get your clients to be able to find you and to be able to identify your ideal client as far as people that can afford you to pay out of pocket and people that maybe are working on specific issues, those kinds of things, which goes a long way in the whole marketing piece, which that's just a whole thing in and of itself. And you weigh that against, okay, do I get on insurance panels? And the advantage to insurance panels is that you've got kind of a built-in referral source by doing that because people will look at their health insurance and they'll say, okay, who's in network with my insurance? And then they'll start finding you. The downside is that you get paid what the insurance company dictates that you get paid.
Mm.
And so, you have to work around that. The other option is really, and this is how my practice is built, is really what I would call a hybrid model in that you accept both cash pay clients and insurance clients. And so you get a mixture there of that. And I think that's a good way to kind of think about it. I think the being on insurance panels takes the pressure off in terms of having a steady flow of clients. Now it doesn't just you don't just flip a switch and all of a sudden you've got people coming to you. It does take time for people to kind of establish their practice and get things going, whichever model they just choose to work with. And I would say on average, most people it takes about 2 years to really get to a place where they feel fully established and have those steady referrals coming in without a whole lot of effort.
Yeah, I really like your perspective there where you're advocating for at least exploring the potential of a hybrid model. I feel like too
Hmm.
often people feel like they have to choose one or the other. So I appreciate that
Hmm.
sort of flexibility.
Hmm.
And for me, I have never taken insurance, and I would also
Hmm.
say that probably delayed my progress in terms of number of clients over the years, right? And so there
Right.
are trade-offs to that. Also, I was working getting referrals from the criminal legal system, right? And so there was
Hmm.
third-party payment that was coming from like the city and counties of, the folks I was
Hmm.
working with. So there are different ways that it can happen, and it can come together in different ways. So I love that sort of flexibility of it. Now, you
Right.
mentioned marketing. This is something I want to
Hmm.
talk more about too, because I think while I'm only 46 years old, although I say only, my two kids would think I'm ancient at being 46, right? But I suppose age is
Right.
relative. But I
Right.
like I'm still relatively young. And I don't have a website. I haven't
Hmm.
done like explicit marketing, although there's something interesting about that term marketing because yes, while I
Hmm.
don't have a website, and by the way, I'm not advocating for that. I think in the modern world, people probably should have websites.
Hmm.
Again, I'm not saying do it the way I did it, but marketing's
Hmm.
interesting because yes, there is the kind of marketing that can take place online or on social media or marketing that you pay for strategically. And then also, I
Hmm.
think sometimes marketing happens in other ways. People are on podcasts or they're on YouTube or they're
Hmm.
doing workshops in the community. And so when I think about marketing, I feel like it can happen in lots of different ways. I'm wondering what you've learned about marketing and effective marketing practices for therapists in private practice.
Right. Right. Well, one of the things that I think is a good reframe of just marketing itself, because I think a lot of times we have there tends to be built in a little bit of an ick factor for those of us that are clinicians, of feeling like we're being too salesy or being
Yep.
putting ourselves out there in that kind of way. But I think a good reframe is to really think about it in terms of positioning yourself in a way that people are able to find you, the people that want to use your services or want to use you specifically, and being able to put yourself out there in that way. And that's where it's, I think, really important to kind of develop a niche for yourself. In other words, thinking about, okay, the people that you enjoy working with the most, the types of issues or the types of people, that being your sweet spot of who you put yourself out there to, and to find out, okay, where do those particular people tend to hang out? And yeah, like you mentioned, social media is a big one, but also just there are various directories you can enroll in. The big one I think about is a psychotherapy network. That's one directory that's out there. So, and then Psychology Today, but different directories you can list yourself there. The other thing to think about, and hopefully I'm not going too far off on a tangent,
No, please keep going.
is, yeah. So is, one of the things, the phenomenon that has happened since really, I guess, since COVID, and it's always interesting to me how we mark time with COVID now, but the advent of kind of big tech getting into the therapy space
Yes.
and
Yes.
things like BetterHelp and Talkspace and those kinds of things. And I think that would be a good starting place for some people to do those kinds of things to start to get sort of get their feet wet. The downside is that kind of like insurance, you get paid what they dictate. And also just, there's, a lot of, and I don't want to again get off on a tangent, but just the thinking about the ethics of those types of
Right.
products and those type of platforms. I'm going to remain neutral on that, but that's something you have to take into consideration about, how client information is shared and all that kind of stuff. And so you've got to kind of weigh out all those different options as far as ways in which to connect with clients. And that's again kind of going back to what I said earlier, to think about marketing as a way to put yourself out there in a way that people can find you and know about you, and also know how you can help them. That's, I think, an important piece to think about with marketing. And still, word of mouth, I think, is one of the best ways to market. I mean, I can't tell you how many people we get referrals from or people come to my practice that they had a friend say, oh, well, Kingsport Counseling is where I go, so you should go there too. And also just former clients, people that you've already worked with will recommend you to their friends. So word of mouth, I think, is a lot of times we don't think about that in terms of marketing, but it is something that is an important piece.
I'm a huge believer in it, probably because that's
Mhm.
mostly what I had, was
Right.
mouth.
Right. Hmm.
And I found and I don't know that this is good advice, by the way, but I've told people that I trust who are making a transition or thinking of making a transition into private practice that, it's like the field of dreams thing. If you build just do good work, just do good work. And then over time, that word of mouth builds over time. And gosh, it seems like, you're talking about COVID and marking time
Mhm.
based on COVID, which is an interesting phenomenon in itself. But I feel like it's more so than ever, people want instant gratification, right? And they
Right.
like things up
Mhm.
and running immediately. And here's the thing,
Mhm.
brought up big tech being in
Mhm.
the therapy space now too. And so
Mhm.
it can happen instantly. I mean, you can go to one of these companies and, and again, the ethics of this and the ethics of client care there, also the ethics of how therapists are treated and compensated. I mean, there's a lot to be considered. We could do a show just on that, but it just happens so quickly. And at least
Mhm.
20 years ago, that wasn't even an option. And so the way that I looked at it, I mean, many people had websites 20 years ago, but I don't feel like it was quite at the level it was at today. I mean, all that to say that people want things quickly and word of mouth. I agree with you. I feel like that's been probably the
Yeah.
biggest influence in me gaining clients over the years. And yet it took many years to get to that point. And so we're in this time where things are moving very fast and people want outcomes very quickly. And yet I
Mhm.
think anyway, some of the strategies that work best require patience.
Right, right. Well, yeah, I love that Field of Dream reference because I use that a lot as well. And I would say what I would add to that is you can build it, but you also have to tell them about it for them to come. And so that's one of the things about marketing is just getting yourself out there in a way that people are aware of what you do. Because I don't think there's ever going to be a lack of clients or patients for the type of work that we do. And I think too, just going back to that COVID reference, I think one of the silver linings with COVID, particularly in our field, is that it kind of helped take away a lot of the stigma around mental health care, and that people were really struggling during COVID just through the isolation, and so people are much more willing to talk about it, and it's almost become, I'm old enough to kind of remember this. If you were seeing a therapist or going to counseling, then you didn't tell anybody about that. But now it's almost like a badge of honor that I've got a therapist and this is who I go to. So things have changed a lot.
Yeah, that shift is really interesting and the sort of TikTokification of mental health, which again
Mhm.
has its pros and cons. I don't think it's all good or all bad. I think it's an interesting phenomenon. It just sort of depends
Yeah.
how we leverage it.
Right. Mhm.
Something else sort of in this post-COVID world is telehealth. Now, telehealth to me sounds like a
Mhm.
term from the 1980s or something. I feel like we need
Right.
a term,
Right.
but the sort of Zoom sorts of therapies, right? And on one hand, this is pretty remarkable that this technology even exists and it can really lower some of the barriers that exist to getting mental health treatment, which is amazing. On the other hand, people have their thoughts about can you do therapy at the same level online that you can do in person? Maybe what's missed, and all those are fair questions. But my question to you is I'm wondering what you're noticing about the ways the proliferation of telehealth might be changing the calculus of people entering private practice.
One of the things that to me I've noticed, and it'd be interesting to maybe do a survey or a study around this, is that at least in my practice, people have a choice of whether they want to do telehealth or online therapy or come in person, and the vast majority of people prefer to come in person. And I think we all kind of crave that human to human contact and actually seeing somebody in 3D rather than 2D. And so I think that's kind of a shift back from what COVID brought us to people who are saying, I want this human to human contact. And I would say that there's always going to be, in fact, I've got a handful of clients now that I'd see just almost exclusively through telehealth or on, video. And mainly it's because of the constraint, work constraints, and it makes it easier for them. They don't have the travel time involved of getting back and forth to the office. And so I think all of that to say is that I think all of this is ever evolving as far as how we deliver our services, and even what constitutes therapy is I think ever changing.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Mhm.
Yeah, I could go down that direction, but I'll
Mhm.
restrain myself from going too far down that direction of
Right,
this conversation. But
right.
yeah, if I could circle back to, this something we have both mentioned a little bit earlier in our conversation, this idea of business and therapy. And, there are some exceptions, but most of us that are going into this field aren't doing it to try and, maximize our earning potential, right? There are other fields we could
Right.
go in that would do that much better. Not to
Mhm.
say there aren't therapists who make plenty of money. I'm just saying, usually the profile of folks going into this field, that's not what they're trying to do, right? They're more interested
Mhm.
in helping folks. That sounds trite, but doing something that serves the community, et cetera. And then, okay, in private practice, it requires you, if you don't have some sort of business acumen, it requires that you develop at least some of it. And within that, I've heard this a lot from therapists. Well, all of a sudden they're maybe coming from an agency where they don't even really handle the money. The front desk does it, and they get paid a salary or whatever it is. And now all of a sudden there's this exchange that they know exactly, quote unquote, what they're worth, what they're being paid, right? So it's $150 per session or $200 per session or whatever it is. I mean, therapists charge different rates, but I've heard a lot of
Mhm.
therapists and I appreciate their willingness to share this sort of thing. It feels vulnerable saying like, am I really worth $150? And they're trying to
Right.
sort of reconcile this feeling of like, even if at some level or at many levels, they know they do good work. All of a sudden, when there's a specific dollar amount attached to it, they
Mhm.
feel more pressure. They feel like they're not worth it. I'm wondering if you've encountered that and maybe how you help folks navigate such a state.
Right. That's something that comes up all the time, and it's really about our mindset around money and how we think about money. All of us grow up with different ideas about money. And for me, as example, I grew up in a family system where money was always seemed like it was always scarce. And we can't afford that. And those are messages we get handed. And there's sometimes even money shaming, like you alluded to, people saying, well, it's not good for me to charge that much. Or am I really worth that much? It's that whole imposter syndrome kind of phenomenon.
Mhm.
But I think it's helpful to really think about money as more of just a vehicle in terms of something that we need to have in order to maintain our lifestyle, our income, something that everybody has to be concerned about. And I think one of the things is really thinking about with the business side of running a private practice is that in order for you to be able to do the work that you love to do and to be able to serve people well, you have to be paid for that. Otherwise, you're not going to stay in business. You're not going to be able to continue your practice because you've not only got what you pay yourself, but there's also what it costs to maintain the practice. You've got office space, you've got websites, you've got, if you go into group, do a group practice, you've got payroll, and all of those kinds of things have to be taken into consideration. And that is of value. And I think the other thing too is that a lot of times we have this myth that people are reluctant to want to pay us. But what I see over and over again is that people really want to pay us. They want to be able to access our services and also feel and recognize the fact that we deserve to be paid for what we do. And so it's a matter of really kind of doing a deep dive kind of in your own personal work of, well, what are the messages that you carry around money? And a lot of us have carried a lot of money shame over the years in different ways. And so it's working through that. And the bottom line and I know I'm repeating myself to some degree, is you have to make a profit in order to sustain your practice. In other words, what you bring in from your practice has to not only cover what you need to pay yourself, but also all the overhead or the different things that are required to just maintain a business and maintain the practice.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting what you just said there. It's a lot of that maybe is our own work around
Mhm,
relationships with money, and then of course that could go
mhm,
even further to our relationships with the economic systems we're a part of,
mhm,
uh,
mhm.
which again, this is not the type of work that often takes place in graduate schools training therapists, right? So it's one of
Right.
these things we come up against later on. Now,
Mhm,
okay, you've consulted, worked with clinicians that are starting private practices.
mhm.
We said this earlier, people have different starting lines for this. Some people come into it with a decent amount of money at their disposal, some people not. So, with the understanding that, of course, the starting points aren't always equal, but I'm wondering if you
Mhm.
noticed any common factors about what maybe separates the people who are quietly succeeding at private practices from those who might be really struggling, even if they're excellent therapists.
Right, right. Well, I think, one of the big things is, and this is a mantra of mine, is, the importance of knowing your numbers. In other words, understanding you don't have to be a CPA or any of that sort of thing, but you have to have some basic understanding about bookkeeping and tracking things and understanding profit and loss, all of those kinds of things. And so educating yourself on that, it's not, I mean, as I say to people, if I learned how to do it, anybody can learn how to do it because I'm not naturally a numbers person. So that was something I had to learn along the way. But once you learn that, I think it kind of helps you, it takes away some of the angst around that, but also setting up realistic expectations for yourself around that. It's a good idea for anybody that is in private practice or I would say any small business to have at the very least 3 months, really ideally 6 months to a year's worth of money in reserve so that if you never saw a client during that period of time, you could still support yourself, but also cover your overhead. And so being able to, if somebody is maybe comes into this without just a whole lot of financial means, is being able to recognize, okay, you can build this from small to big. And I think incremental change is more sustainable than huge leaping changes. And so I think being able to think about it that way in terms of, okay, we're just going to see X number of clients today. And so being able to make sure that that's profitable for you. And as you grow, being able to make the shift of, okay, how much clinical work do I want to do up against the administrative work? Being able to kind of think about it from those two different perspectives, I think goes a long way in helping people become successful in private practice.
A phrase that has been around for a while. I think I'm hearing it even more, and that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be a commentary on the state of the world. It could be a lot of different things, but the phrase is burnout. I'm wondering what you've seen in terms of burnout in private practice, and maybe what is it that can help mitigate this? I mean, maybe part of it is what do they actually mean when they say I'm feeling burned out? That could be a little different from person to person, but just in a general
Right.
sense, when you start hearing that from folks, what have you learned might be helpful in mitigating that feeling of burnout?
Right. Well, I think, when I think about burnout, I kind of equate it to, in some ways, to being overwhelmed with something, trying to juggle too much, having too much on your plate, and being constantly in almost kind of a state of anxiety all the time over your practice and what you're doing. And so I think one of the things is being able to, particularly in private practice, is not isolate yourself so much because particularly for solo practitioners, I think it's real easy to do that and that you're not having a lot of interaction with colleagues and other people. And I think that can lead to burnout as much as anything is feeling like, okay, I'm doing doing all this stuff, but it's just overwhelming for me. Another area is learning to let go of some things and also delegate more in terms of what you do. It's real easy to, like one of the big low hanging fruits I tell people all the time is hiring at least a virtual assistant to answer phone calls and schedule people because where we make our money is, as they say, is butts and chairs, and we've got to have those people in front of us in order for us to be profitable and to bring in some income. But just being able to recognize that it's going to take time to build to some degree. But if you do the right things as far as marketing, networking, all that sort of thing, it takes a lot of the pressure off. And when we're not under pressure, we don't feel quite as burned out.
I'm also wondering, we've talked a lot, of course, about how money factors into this just because it's such a big obstacle, or at least it feels like such a big obstacle for many people considering private practice. I'm wondering beyond just money, when you think about what leads practitioners into, having meaningful careers in private practice, what are some of the
Mhm.
factors you've noticed? Is there, you were just mentioning, for example, connection with other people, right? That it can be sort
Mhm.
of, if
Mhm.
it's set up a particular way, it could be a lonely or isolating experience over time. So connection. I'm wondering if you've noticed any other factors about what helps private practitioners thrive in their careers.
I think as much as anything, having a community of people that you know and trust. And whether that's, yeah, I would say not only within your private practice world, but also just in your life in general, of being able to have those people that are your close friends, people that you do things with, people that are, having a life outside the office, I think is an important piece in recharging our batteries so that we're not as burned out. And so I know that for the people that have listened to my podcast, and I've shared my story over the years, my wife passed away in 2023, and it was after a long battle with breast cancer and metastasis. And so I really had to kind of step back from my practice a good bit. But what helped me maintain all of that was the fact that I was willing to outsource and delegate things to people within my practice. If I had gone through all of that without that support and also my community of friends just within, my own social circles and people I hang out with were a huge support to me through all of that. And I think when you have those things in place like that, of people that are you know, like, and trust, people that you just are there by your side, so to speak, that helps keep us from being burned out, I believe.
Mm. Yeah. And, your story just serves to remind us that therapists are human beings and we
Mhm.
have
Mhm.
lives going on outside of the work that we're doing. And maybe the more we can put some of what you were just saying into play in a preemptive fashion, right? So
Mhm.
that we've got it in place when we most need it. That in itself seems like a really good piece of advice. Now,
Mhm.
okay, I want you to imagine that you're sitting with a younger version of yourself. And let's say that
Mhm.
that younger version of yourself was on the day that you were first starting private practice, like the opening.
Mhm.
What's one thing that you might tell him that would have saved him maybe years of frustration?
I would say, as much as anything, and this is a kind of repeating myself, is making connections with people that are colleagues. Not only that, but also delegating and outsourcing stuff more quickly
Yep.
rather than trying to juggle it all. And so, again, some of the, I like to call it the low hanging fruits with those are hiring an assistant or a virtual assistant or however you do it to answer the phone and return people's phone calls. Because if you're having to carve out part of your day to do all of that, that is not a way that brings in any income for you. And so it's worth it to pay someone to do that, and there's just lots of different ways to go about having an intake coordinator or someone that handles that piece for you. And of course, AI is a whole other thing that has come into being, as far as the different ways you can use that tool to kind of manage what you're doing in your practice and what you need and require for your life.
Yeah, and you said, I'm repeating myself, but I actually appreciate that because I think it's driving home some of the most important aspects of what you've noticed and doing this work
Mhm.
over the years and consulting with others. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure I talk a little bit about, your podcast. And I
Mhm.
started hosting this a little over a year ago, and none of us went to school for podcast hosting. Although I guess you could
Right.
go to school, for media or something. But
Uh-huh.
I think most of us that are doing this kind of came into it just because we had a passion or an interest or whatever and started talking to people about it. But
Right.
you have hundreds of podcast episodes at this point, and I'm
Mhm.
wondering what you've learned through the process of being a podcast host.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think, what I love about having a podcast is, like I said earlier, is being able to have one-on-one conversations with people from literally all over the world. And I think one of the things that feedback I get from people is that is not to always assume that obviously I don't know everything there is to know about private practice, but being able to kind of learn from other people and just being able to hear their stories really, I think, adds to your success and your connection in the community. And so I think I might have veered off from your question there, but what one of the things that when I started the practice of therapy was really helping people connect with resources and other people to help them in their private practice, whether it's just the practical side of things, like what sort of phone service to use, what sort of electronic health record system to use, just down to how do you connect with other people and being able to feel like you're living life to the fullest.
I feel like this is a tough question. I'm just imagining someone asking me this, right? And I get that it's tough. And
Hmm.
maybe maybe it's like feels like you're choosing who your favorite child is or something. But so it could be more than one. But I'm wondering, as you
Hmm.
think back on these hundreds of podcast episodes, are there particular conversations or moments that have stayed with you long after the episode was recorded?
I've had the good fortune of being able to interview some kinda, I would say, quasi-famous people, and, one person that had a big impact on me as far as how I ran my practice specifically was, Mike Michalowicz, the author of Profit First, and that's, when I'm consulting with people, I say, "Okay, this is when you're learning the business side of things, this is a good go-to book to begin with." And another person that is a good friend of mine is Julie Harris, who runs Green Oak Accounting. She wrote a book, kind of a follow-up book, very niche specific to Mike Michalowicz's book, and it's just called Profit First for Therapists. And so it's geared specifically for that particular understanding the financial side of running a private practice. But also, I would say just my podcast is kind of a mixture of both the business topics, but also I love talking about various clinical topics. And
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm old enough to recognize that one of the big changes and from where I started out in the therapy world to where we are now is the whole advent of somatic work and just also things like EMDR, also the use of ketamine and just alternative therapies and that kind of thing has been just fascinating to see how that has come onto the forefront with just our professions in general, and just taking kind of that look at the whole body experience of mental health. And so different people that I've interviewed around those topics have just been absolutely fascinating. Probably if I thought about it long enough, I could come up with some names, but I think the other thing too about podcast is it's really allowed me to connect with some people that have actually become great friends over the years and people that I interact with pretty regularly. One in particular is my good friend Dr. David Hall, who is well, we live close enough. He's in Knoxville, Tennessee, so we're only about an hour and a half apart, but we've become very good friends, and we have, do very similar things. And so if I've got a question about something or something that is a dilemma for me within my practice or even with my podcast and consulting world, David's kind of my go-to person. And so I developed that relationship, yeah, just out of meeting David through my podcast. And so I think that's been just a huge, at least for me personally, just a huge thing is just connecting with people and over the years in doing the podcast.
Gosh, I can relate to that so much, even just doing this for about a year or so, the different people that I've made connections with and also all that I've learned. I mean, it's just really
Mhm.
cool talking to people and I just feel fortunate. I mean, I guess, someone could have listened to every episode. I mean, that would be quite a commitment, but maybe there's
Right.
some people out there who've listened to every episode. But I feel like for me too, preparing for the episodes, right? Really
Mhm.
thinking about people's stories and how they got where they are and thinking of questions that might be interesting to ask, that just adds like a deeper
Mhm.
layer to that learning for me. And the relationships I've built, and then also just the learnings that have happened have been really cool for me. All right.
Right.
I want to
Right.
ask you one last question. And this question for me is rooted, largely in being an educator, right? And then thinking
Mhm.
about how we could best train therapists. And so much of
Mhm.
our conversation today has been focused on private practice, preparing people for private practice, some of the barriers to getting into private practice, et cetera. So if you could change one thing about how, formalized graduate programs prepare therapists for private practice, what would it be and why?
If graduate programs were to just offer a course in, private practice management, for example, and it doesn't have to have a whole lot of bells and whistles. One of the things that projects I'm working on right now in conjunction with the Metro United Way in Louisville, Kentucky, is teaching people that are working for agencies how to go into private practice. And so it's been a great exercise for me to really kind of put it into kind of more academic terms and as far as coming up with a course teaching these various skills. But I think on one of the other things that I think is really an important piece is the person of the therapist. And we hear that all the time, in our training and clinical work, and the importance of that, of having that relationship with clients. And I think the same goes with having those relationships with our colleagues. But I think being able to be a really good therapist is to really know yourself well and know what it is that you want to accomplish by going into private practice. And I think there's a lot of different reasons why people go into private practice, but I think as much as anything of just thinking about why you choose what you do. And people hear this from me all the time on the practice of therapy is know your why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Because like you said earlier, Travis, is that there's a lot of different other things that we could do, but when thinking about, okay, what is it? Why is it that you want to do what you do? And so I don't know if that's getting at your question exactly, but I think as much as anything is being able to embrace both the business side and the clinical side and see how they kind of overlap, I think is something that's really something worthwhile for people to continue to look into.
So there's the Practice of Therapy podcast. Obviously, folks can
Mhm.
go and subscribe to that wherever they get their podcasts. Any
Uh-huh.
resources that you might direct people towards if they're interested in the
Yeah.
topic of private practice?
There are tons of great consultants out there, just a lot of different podcasts on private practice building and being in private practice. I think about probably when I first started my podcast, there were just a handful of us that were doing that. And now, no telling how many there are. But one of the things I did a few years ago is started, and still a work in progress. I started the PsychCraft Network, which is just a psych craft, it's all one word, network, and you can go to psychcraftnetwork.com to find that, but also the practiceoftherapy.com. I didn't mention my website, but those are good starting places to start looking for resources. And one of the things that I've got on my website, in addition to the podcasts, are just various other resources that are out there for people. I've got a free private practice startup guide that I'm in the process of updating. It's been a while since I've updated it, but just by going to the website and signing up for my email list, and I send out emails every week just with different resources and the different episodes from my podcast. And there's just the whole network of information through those two places.
Gordon, I really appreciate it. The hours flown by. This is a topic that so many folks are interested in, and I'm just grateful you took some time to share your wisdom and expertise with us.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Travis. It was an honor to be here.
Let's talk again soon.
Okay, thanks.